Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the wilderness isn't what you can see, it's what you wake up. For 20 years, Aisling Drake walked the Pacific Northwest mountains alone, finding peace in places where most people feared to go. She knew every ridge, every hidden valley, every warning sign the forest offered. But on a quiet morning deep in the ancient cedars, she found something that shouldn't exist. A massive honeycomb dripping with golden honey that glowed like captured sunlight. It was beautiful. It was impossible. And it was guarded by something far worse than any bear or mountain lion she'd ever faced. What she didn't know was that some secrets have been buried in these mountains for centuries, for very good reasons. What was protecting that honey? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story intrigues you, make sure you're subscribed. The brass compass had been her father's, and before that, his father's. Aisling Drake turned it over in her calloused hands, watching the morning light catch the Celtic symbols etched into its weathered surface. The needle pointed north, steady and true, just as it had for 50 years. She tucked it into her vest pocket, feeling its familiar weight settle against her ribs like an old friend's hand on her shoulder. At 52, Aisling had the kind of face that told stories without words. Deep lines framed her grey-green eyes, etched there by countless days, squinting into mountain sun and wind. Her hands were strong, scarred from brambles and rocks, capable of building a shelter or identifying a plant by touch alone. Her dark hair, threaded heavily with silver now, was pulled back in a practical braid that hung past her shoulders. She moved with the deliberate grace of someone who understood that haste in the wilderness could cost you everything. Her cabin sat at the edge of civilization, where the logging roads ended and the true wild began. It was small, built from cedar and stone, with a wide porch that faced the mountains. Inside, everything had its place. Field guides organized by region and season, botanical specimens pressed between pages of heavy books. Maps marked with her careful notations from 2 decades of solitary exploration. The walls held photographs of her late father in his ranger uniform, one of her and her husband on their wedding day, and dozens of landscapes she'd captured over the years. She'd been alone for 5 years now. Michael had died suddenly, a heart attack while teaching at the community college where he'd worked for 30 years. No warning, no goodbye, just there one morning and gone by afternoon. They'd had no children. She'd thrown herself into fieldwork after his death, spending more and more time in the mountains, less and less in the small town where people looked at her with pitying eyes and careful words. The mountains didn't pity. They simply were. They demanded respect, offered beauty, and asked nothing of her grief except that she carry it as she carried her pack, with care and attention to where she placed each step. You planning to stay gone the whole 2 weeks this time? Roy Brennan stood in her driveway, leaning against his old pickup truck. He was 67, with a weathered face and hands that shook slightly from arthritis. He'd been with the Forest Service for 40 years before retiring, and he'd known her father. "That's the plan," Aisling said, adjusting the straps on her pack. It was heavy, loaded with supplies for an extended expedition into Cedar Basin. The weather windows perfect. "And I want to document the High Valley flora before the first frost." Roy shifted his weight, and she noticed he was favoring his left leg more than usual. The arthritis was getting worse. He tried to hide it, but she'd known him too long. "You know that area's been closed to logging for 60 years? There's a reason the old-timers won't go up there." "Old stories," Aisling said, but gently. She respected Roy too much to dismiss him outright. "Every remote place has them. Your father used to say the same thing." Roy pulled a paper bag from his truck bed. "Brought you some extra batteries and that freeze-dried stuff you like." "The coffee one, not the cardboard pasta." She smiled, taking the bag. This was their routine. He'd bring supplies, warn her about weather or terrain, and tell her to be careful. She'd thank him, promise to check in by radio, and go anyway. "I appreciate it, Roy. I'll call in every evening at 6. "The bee activity's been strange up there this season," Roy said, and something in his tone made her pause. "Multiple reports from hikers. Swarms in places they shouldn't be, behaving aggressive. Fish and Wildlife's been trying to track it, but they can't pin down a source." "I'll be careful," Aisling promised. She'd been stung before. You didn't spend 20 years in the backcountry without learning to respect every creature that called it home. Roy nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It was old, the colors faded, showing her father standing next to a massive cedar tree. She'd never seen it before. Found this in some old files I was organizing. Thought you might want it. He was up in Cedar Basin when that was taken. Summer of 1995. Aisling studied the photograph. Her father looked younger, maybe 45, but there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. Not quite worry, but not peace either. Wariness, perhaps? Like he was looking at something just beyond the camera's view. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I didn't know he'd been up there. He went up a few times. Always came back quiet." Roy cleared his throat. "Just be smart up there, Aisling. Trust your gut if something feels wrong." She tucked the photograph carefully into her journal next to her father's compass. "Always do." The drive to the trailhead took 90 minutes on increasingly rough roads. Aisling's truck handled it well. She'd replaced the suspension specifically for these journeys. At the end of the logging road, where the pavement crumbled into dirt and then into nothing, she parked and began her final preparations. The pack went on first, settling familiar weight across her shoulders and hips. 60 pounds of gear, food and equipment, all essential. She'd learned decades ago to pack light but complete. Every item earned its place through necessity. Her father had taught her that. Never carry what you don't need, but always have what you might need. The compass rode in her vest pocket, her satellite phone and radio clipped to her belt. Water filter, first aid kit, fire starter, shelter, food, climbing rope, emergency beacon. Everything checked twice. The trail started easy, a well-maintained path that wound through old-growth forest. Douglas fir and western hemlock towered overhead, their canopy filtering the morning light into green-gold shafts. Sword ferns carpeted the forest floor. The air smelled of pitch and earth and the particular cleanness of undisturbed wilderness. Aisling walked with the efficient rhythm of long practice. Not too fast, not too slow. Save energy for the long haul. Stop to drink before you're thirsty. Eat before you're hungry. Watch where you place your feet. Her father's voice in her head, even after all these years. By noon, she'd left the maintained trail behind. This was her specialty. The unmapped places, the valleys too remote for casual hikers, the zones where plants grew that might be found nowhere else. She was documenting them for the university, building a comprehensive botanical survey of the region. It was solitary work, sometimes tedious, but it mattered. Understanding what grew where, how ecosystems functioned in isolation, what thrived without human interference, this knowledge had value. The terrain grew steeper. She picked her way up a ridge, using her hands as much as her feet, breathing hard but steady. At the top she paused to rest and take in the view. Behind her the valley spread out in waves of green. Ahead, the mountains climbed higher still, their peaks touched with early snow despite it being only September. Somewhere in those heights lay Cedar Basin, her destination. She ate trail mix and drank deeply from her water bottle, feeling the familiar satisfaction of physical exhaustion earned through effort. Her legs ached pleasantly. Sweat cooled on her skin in the mountain breeze. This was where she felt most herself, alone but not lonely, challenged but capable, small in the face of something vast and ancient and beautiful. The second day brought her to the edge of Cedar Basin. The descent was tricky, requiring careful navigation down a scree slope where one wrong step could mean a twisted ankle or worse. She took it slow, testing each foothold, using her trekking poles for balance. By late afternoon, she reached the valley floor. Cedar Basin lived up to its name. Ancient cedars, some of them surely 500 years old or more, rose like cathedral pillars from the forest floor. Their trunks were massive, 10 feet across in some cases, their bark deeply furrowed and fragrant. Moss hung in thick curtains from their branches. The air here felt different, older somehow, quieter, as though the forest held its breath. Aisling made camp near a small stream in a clearing that offered good drainage and protection from wind. She set up her tent with practiced efficiency, arranged her gear, and filtered water for the evening. As the sun slanted low through the trees, she sat on a fallen log and wrote in her journal, documenting the day's observations. Species identified, terrain covered, weather conditions, notable landmarks. She pulled out the photograph Roy had given her, studying it in the fading light. Her father stood before a cedar that could be any of the giants surrounding her now. But something about his posture bothered her. He looked like he was guarding something, or maybe guarding against something. That night she slept deeply, lulled by the sound of the stream and the whisper of wind through cedar boughs. She dreamed of walking through the forest with her father, both of them younger, him showing her how to read the land. In the dream, he kept glancing over his shoulder as if checking for something following. When she asked what he was looking for, he put a finger to his lips and said, "Some things sleep better when left undisturbed." She woke before dawn to the sound of bees, not the lazy drone of a few workers going about their business, but a focused hum that seemed to fill the air with purpose. Aisling lay in her tent listening. The sound came from deeper in the valley, persistent and strange. She'd heard plenty of bees in her years outdoors, but never quite like this. It was almost musical, rising and falling in waves. Curiosity won over caution. She dressed, made coffee over her camp stove, and ate a quick breakfast of oatmeal and dried fruit. Then she packed a day bag with essentials and headed toward the sound. The forest here was pristine. No signs of human passage, except the faint game trails she followed. Deer had been through recently. She saw their tracks in the soft earth. A black bear had marked a tree, claw marks high enough to remind her that she wasn't the largest creature in these woods. She moved quietly, observing everything, her senses fully engaged. The humming grew louder. She pushed through a curtain of ferns and stopped dead in her tracks. Before her stood the largest cedar she'd ever seen. It had to be 20 feet in diameter, ancient beyond measuring, its lowest branches starting 40 feet above the ground. But it wasn't the tree that made her breath catch. Attached to the massive trunk, perhaps 15 feet up, was a honeycomb structure the size of a small car. Golden honey dripped slowly from it, catching the morning light in a way that seemed impossible. The honey glowed. Not metaphorically, not in the way sunlight makes things luminous, but actually glowed with an inner light, as if it contained captured sunshine. And the bees. There must have been thousands of them, swirling around the hive in complex patterns that seemed almost deliberate. They weren't just flying randomly, they moved like a living tapestry, weaving patterns in the air. Aisling stood perfectly still, her heart pounding. In 20 years of wilderness exploration, she'd never seen anything remotely like this. The scientist in her mind raced through possibilities. Bioluminescence? But honey didn't bioluminesce. Reflection. But the light seemed to come from within. Some kind of contamination that caused the glow? She took a careful step closer. The bees' humming shifted in pitch, but they didn't swarm. They simply continued their intricate aerial dance. Another step. The honey's glow seemed to pulse gently like a heartbeat. Common sense told her to back away, to document from a distance, to be cautious. But something else pulled her forward. A curiosity so profound it felt almost like recognition, as if she'd been meant to find this place. She reached for her camera, hands steady despite her racing pulse, and began to document what she was seeing. Whatever this was, it was extraordinary. Possibly a discovery that could change understanding of bee behavior, of honey production, of forest ecosystems. What she couldn't know, standing there in the ancient grove, with glowing honey dripping from an impossible hive, was that she'd just found something that should have remained lost. Something that had been guarded and hidden and protected for reasons that went far deeper than science could explain. Some secrets, her father had said in her dream, sleep better when left undisturbed. She'd just woken one up. Aisling spent 3 hours photographing the hive from every angle, taking notes, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The morning sun climbed higher, but the honey's glow didn't fade with increased daylight. If anything, it seemed to pulse more strongly, as if responding to her presence. The bees maintained their distance, circling the hive in those strange, deliberate patterns. She'd studied pollinator behavior as part of her botanical work, knew enough to recognize that this wasn't normal. Bees didn't coordinate like this, didn't move with such obvious purpose. These looked like regular honeybees, Apis mellifera, the common European variety introduced to North America, but their behavior was anything but common. She approached closer, moving slowly, watching for any sign of aggression. 20 feet from the tree, 15. The humming shifted again, took on what she could only describe as an interrogative tone, like they were asking her a question she couldn't understand. 10 feet away now, she could see the honey more clearly. It moved like regular honey, thick and viscous, but the glow came from within each droplet. Golden light that seemed alive, that made her think of autumn's sunshine captured in liquid form. Beautiful, impossible. She reached for one of her collection vials, the kind she used for plant samples. Her hands moved without conscious thought, driven by decades of scientific training. Document, collect, analyze, understand. That was the process. That was how you solved mysteries. The moment her gloved fingers touched the honey, everything changed. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. Warmth flooded through her hand, up her arm, spreading through her entire body like she'd been dipped in heated gold. Her senses sharpened impossibly. She could smell every plant in the surrounding forest individually, the pitch of each cedar, the mineral scent of the stream, the rich decay of leaf litter, even the pollen carried on individual bees. She could hear her own heartbeat, the rush of blood through her veins, the whisper of moss growing on stone. The honey flowed into her vial, more than should fit, yet the container held it all. She pulled her hand back, dizzy, her heart racing. The vial felt warm in her palm. The honey inside continued to glow, lighting up her collection bag like a tiny lantern. The bees humming crescendoed. They didn't attack, but they circled closer now, hundreds of them forming a living sphere around her. She stood very still, barely breathing. They moved in patterns around her face, her body, investigating her with an intensity that felt almost conscious, almost aware. Then, as suddenly as they'd surrounded her, they withdrew. The sphere collapsed back into the flowing patterns around the hive. The humming returned to its earlier rhythm, but something had shifted. Aisling felt it in her bones, a sense that she'd just crossed a threshold she hadn't known existed. She backed away slowly, the vial clutched in her hand. Her skin tingled. Colors seemed brighter, edges sharper. The forest hummed with life. She'd never quite perceived this clearly before. Every sound, every scent, every texture felt amplified. Back at her camp, she sat on her log and stared at the vial. The honey still glowed, pulsing gently in time with her heartbeat. That couldn't be real. That couldn't be possible. But there it was, undeniable and sitting in her hand. She pulled out her field testing kit and began a basic analysis. pH test first. The strip turned colors she'd never seen from honey before. Dissolved it in water for microscopy. Under her portable scope, the cellular structure looked wrong. Too organized, almost crystalline in its geometry. Nothing in her botanical or biochemical knowledge explained this. The rational part of her mind kept trying to find explanations. Contamination from rare minerals, unique pollen sources, some kind of fungal symbiosis creating bioluminescence. But none of it fit. None of it explained the way she'd felt when she touched it, or the way the bees had responded. She should leave. Take the sample, hike back to civilization, get it to a real laboratory where proper analysis could be done. That was the sensible thing. The scientific thing. Instead, she found herself thinking about her father, standing before that cedar tree, looking wary. About Roy's warnings. About old stories. The afternoon passed in a haze. She tried to work on her regular botanical surveys, documenting the plants she'd come here to study, but her mind kept drifting back to the hive. The honey's glow called to her even from inside her pack, a gentle pull she couldn't quite ignore. As evening approached, she tried her radio. Static greeted her, thick and crackling. She adjusted frequencies, checked connections. Nothing but white noise, and underneath it something that sounded almost like whispers. She switched to her satellite phone. No signal. That made no sense. Satellite phones worked anywhere with clear sky, and she had clear sky. A flutter of unease moved through her chest. She was 3 days' hike from the nearest road, alone, with no way to communicate. But she'd been in that position before. The wilderness didn't care about your convenience or your comfort. You adapted or you suffered. That night she dreamed vividly. She walked through Cedar Basin, but it was different, older, more ancient. The trees were the same, yet somehow younger. Indigenous people moved through the forest with quiet purpose. She saw them approach the massive cedar, saw them perform some kind of ceremony around it. Offerings placed at its base, words spoken in a language she didn't know, but somehow understood. Protection, agreement, balance. Then the dream shifted. White men in old-fashioned logging gear, saws biting into bark. The cedar bleeding, actually bleeding, red sap flowing like blood, screaming. The bees swarming in deadly clouds, men running, falling, dying. And something else, something massive and ancient rising from the tree itself, made of wood and honey and rage. She woke gasping, her sleeping bag damp with sweat. Dawn light filtered through her tent. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. Even the stream seemed muted. O'Sling dressed quickly and stepped outside. The air felt heavy, expectant. She looked toward where the great cedar stood, invisible through the trees, but present in her mind like a lodestone pulling at iron. The honey called to her. She could feel it, warm against her ribs, where the vial rested in her vest pocket next to her father's compass. Just a small taste whispered a thought that didn't quite feel like her own. Just to understand, just to know. She walked toward the cedar before fully deciding to. Her feet found the path automatically, as if she'd walked it 1,000 times before. The forest opened before her, seeming to guide her steps. When she reached the clearing, she stopped. The hive had grown. She was certain of it. It was larger now, spreading further down the trunk, more honey dripping in golden streamers. The bees' humming had changed too, deeper, more resonant, almost like chanting. And there, at the base of the tree, she saw something she'd missed before. Carved into the massive trunk, worn almost smooth with age but still visible, were symbols. Not words, not quite pictures, but something in between. They spiraled around the trunk, disappearing into the earth where the roots began. She knelt to examine them, running her fingers over the ancient marks. The moment she touched them, knowledge flooded her mind. Not words, not language, but pure understanding. This tree was sacred. This honey was protected. This place was guarded, and she had just broken a covenant that had held for centuries. Behind her something moved. Not the wind, not an animal. Something large and deliberate and ancient. She turned slowly, her heart in her throat. The forest at her back had changed. Shadows pooled in places where sunlight should reach. The shadows had shape, almost had substance, and in those shadows something watched her with awareness that predated human presence in these mountains. The guardian had awakened, and it was not pleased. Aisling ran, not in panic, but in controlled retreat, her wilderness training overriding the primal urge to simply bolt. Don't run from predators. Don't turn your back on threats, but move deliberately. Create distance. Reassess. She made it back to her camp in record time, her enhanced senses still active from touching the honey, making her hyper-aware of every snapping twig, every rustling leaf. Nothing followed her, at least nothing she could see, but the feeling of being watched persisted, raising the hair on her arms and the back of her neck. Her hands shook slightly as she boiled water for coffee. The mundane action helped center her. Routine mattered in the wilderness. Routine kept you sane when circumstances tested your grip on reality. And what she'd just experienced was definitely testing that grip. The scientist in her needed to rationalize what was happening. She pulled out her field journal and began writing, trying to organize her thoughts through documentation, observations, hypotheses, testable predictions. The method had served her entire career. Entry 1. The honey exhibits properties inconsistent with known biological processes. Luminescence without apparent energy source. Enhanced sensory perception upon contact. Questions: is this a hallucinogenic effect? Contamination with psychoactive compounds. Entry 2. B. Behavior highly organized, possibly indicating advanced colony intelligence or external control mechanism. Questions. Pheromonal communication on unprecedented level. Parasitic influence. Environmental factors. Entry 3. Symbols on tree appear to be indigenous in origin. Age uncertain but significant. Connection to local tribal history. Questions. Research needed on regional indigenous peoples and their relationship to Cedar Basin. She paused, pen hovering over the page. How did she write about the shadows that seemed to have substance? About the sense of ancient awareness? Those observations didn't fit into neat scientific categories. Her father's photograph lay beside her journal. She picked it up, studying his expression more carefully now. That wariness she'd noticed before, it made sense now. He'd known something. He'd been here, seen this, maybe even experienced what she was experiencing. And he'd never told her. Why not? The question burned. Her father had taught her everything about wilderness survival, about reading the land, about respect for nature. But he'd kept this secret. Had he been protecting her? Or protecting whatever guarded this place? Aisling set down the journal and pulled out the honey vial. The glow had not diminished. If anything, it seemed brighter in the morning light, pulsing steadily. Beautiful and terrifying all at once. Against her better judgment, she unscrewed the cap. The scent hit her immediately, impossibly complex. Wildflowers, yes, but also cedar and stone. And something else, something that smelled like memory itself. Like standing in her grandmother's kitchen as a child. Like her wedding day. Like the morning her father died. She dipped a fingertip into the honey. Just a taste, just to understand. The effect was instantaneous. The world exploded into clarity. She could see individual pollen grains on the bees that flew past her camp. Could hear the stream's water molecules separating over stones. Could feel the earth's slow rotation beneath her feet. Her mind expanded, touching something vast and old and aware, and in that expanded state she understood. The honey wasn't just honey. It was a bridge, a connection between the physical and something else, something the modern world had forgotten how to perceive. The indigenous peoples had known. They'd made agreements, performed rituals, maintained balance, and then others had come, had tried to take without asking, and the balance had shattered. The vision faded, leaving her gasping. Her mouth tingled with sweetness. Her heart raced. But beneath the physical sensations, her mind worked frantically. If the honey created this connection, this bridge, then maybe communication was possible. Maybe she could explain, apologize, make things right. She just needed to understand what had happened here, needed to know the full story. The answer came when she decided to explore the area around the Great Cedar more systematically. She approached cautiously this time, watching for any sign of the shadowy presence from before. The forest seemed calmer now, less oppressive, though still unnaturally quiet. Near the dried stream bed 50 yards from the cedar, something caught her eye. A stone, flat and smooth, half buried in the earth. Not natural, too symmetrical. She knelt and carefully excavated it. The packed stone, though she didn't know to call it that yet, was roughly the size of a dinner plate. Its surface was covered in the same symbols she'd seen on the cedar trunk, but these were clearer, better preserved. She ran her fingers over them, and again knowledge came, not complete, but fragments: agreement, harvest, healing, protection, guardian, balance. The pieces started coming together. The honey was meant to be shared, but carefully, respectfully, under specific conditions. The symbols told the story of a covenant between the people who'd lived here and whatever entity protected this place. They could take the honey for medicine, for healing, but never for greed, never more than freely given. And in return, they would protect the cedar, respect the forest, maintain the sacred space. But that agreement had been broken. The vision from her dreams returned: loggers, saws, blood-red sap. They'd tried to cut down the cedar itself, probably drawn by the valuable timber, and the Guardian had responded with lethal force. Since then, how many years? Aisling did quick math. The logging clothes in her vision looked late 1800s. Over a century of the Guardian keeping watch, keeping everyone away, protecting the cedar in isolation. growing more and more defensive, more hostile to any human presence. And now she'd come, collected the honey without permission, without ritual, without understanding. No wonder she was being watched. No wonder the guardian had awakened. A sound made her look up. The bees were approaching, but not swarming. They flew in a tight formation, dozens of them, and they were carrying something. She watched in amazement as they carefully maneuvered their burden closer. A small piece of obsidian, black and glassy and sharp. They deposited it at her feet, then retreated. The humming took on an expectant quality. Aisling picked up the obsidian shard carefully. It was roughly triangular, about 4 inches long, with symbols carved into its surface. These symbols were different from the ones on the stone and tree, more pictographic, more like a warning. She held it up to the light, and the symbols seemed to move, telling a story in images that bypassed language entirely. She saw the honey's creation, born from the body of an ancient chief buried beneath the cedar. Saw his spirit becoming part of the tree, the forest, creating the guardian to protect his resting place. Saw the covenant made, then broken. Saw the curse that followed. Anyone who took the honey without permission would be bound to it, transformed by it, unable to leave. The obsidian warmed in her hand. She looked at the honey vial in her other hand, then at her own body. The enhanced senses hadn't faded. They'd become her new normal. The pull toward the cedar hadn't weakened. If anything, it had grown stronger. Understanding crashed over her like cold water. She was already bound. The moment she'd touched the honey, collected it, tasted it, she'd activated the curse. She was connected now, whether she wanted to be or not. The question wasn't whether she could leave. The question was whether she could survive what came next. Aisling decided to hike back toward the trail, to test whether she actually could leave. She packed her essentials, left the bulk of her gear at camp, and headed in what should have been the direction of the main path. 2 hours later, she stood in the exact same clearing she'd started from. She tried again, taking a different route this time, marking trees as she went. 3 hours of hiking. Same result. The forest had become a maze, paths leading in circles, landmarks shifting, everything familiar becoming subtly wrong. She wasn't lost. She knew these mountains too well for that. She was being kept. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a strange calm settling over her bones. Terror was for situations where panic might help you survive. This was something else. This required thought, patience, understanding. She returned to her base camp as afternoon shadows grew long. The forest was teaching her its rhythms now. The bees were most active in the morning. The shadows deepened around sunset. The guardian's presence was strongest at dawn and dusk, those liminal times when worlds touched. While organizing her gear, her hand brushed against something wedged between her sleeping bag and tent wall. Paper old and fragile. She pulled it out carefully. It was a page from a journal, not hers. The handwriting made her heart stop. She'd recognize her father's neat script anywhere. The page was torn, water-stained, but mostly legible. Dated August 17th, 1995. 30 years ago. She read it 3 times, her hands trembling. Day 4 in Cedar Basin. Found the honey today. Should have left it alone. The bees know. They're watching. Can feel something else watching, too. The locals were right about this place. Some boundaries shouldn't be crossed. The honey calls to me even now, hours later. Had dreams of the ancient chief, the covenant, the guardian. I understand now why the Forest Service keeps this area closed. It's not about preservation. It's about protection. Protecting us from what lives here, and protecting what lives here from us. Note to self, if I make it out, never come back. Never tell Aisling. She has her mother's curiosity and my stubbornness. She'd want to understand. Some things aren't meant to be understood, just respected. The honey chooses its keeper. Resist the call. Must resist. The entry ended abruptly, the last words trailing off as if he'd been interrupted. Aisling sat very still, the page trembling in her grip. Her father had been here, had found the honey, had experienced what she was experiencing, and he'd gotten out somehow, though the entry's tone suggested it hadn't been easy. But there was something else, something that made her chest tight. Her mother had died when Aisling was 12. Cancer, they'd said. Sudden, aggressive, mysterious. But now, reading this, she wondered, had her father tried to use the honey? Had he broken the covenant trying to heal his wife? Was that why the Guardian had let him leave, but marked him? Marked him so that 30 years later he died suddenly in these same mountains, claimed by a debt unpaid. Too many questions, too much unknown family history tangled up in ancient secrets. She needed more information. Her father's full journals were back at her cabin, but she had her phone. Even without signal, she downloaded reference materials before leaving, including historical records of indigenous peoples in the Pacific Northwest. She spent the evening reading by lantern light, cross-referencing the symbols she'd photographed from the cedar and the pack stone with known indigenous iconography. The match came from the Salish peoples, specifically a subgroup that had inhabited this region before European contact. Their stories spoke of sacred groves where the boundary between worlds grew thin, places where the spirits of great chiefs were buried with ceremony and power. The honey wasn't just honey. It was the chief's life essence, transformed and preserved, maintaining the forest's health. Taking it without permission was taking part of the chief's soul itself. The Guardian wasn't a monster. It was a protector, born from the chief's final act of love for his people and his land. It was supposed to work in partnership with humans, not in opposition to them. The Salish had maintained that partnership for generations. Then colonizers came, then loggers. Then the covenant shattered. The Guardian had been alone for over a century, protecting something sacred in the only way it knew, through isolation and force. Eileen closed her phone and sat in the darkness, thinking. Her father had written that the honey chooses its keeper. Maybe she hadn't stumbled here by accident. Maybe she'd been drawn here, selected. But for what purpose? The bees arrived as full darkness fell. They clustered around her tent, humming a complex pattern. She stepped outside, and they surrounded her gently, landing on her arms, her shoulders, her hair. Their touch was delicate, almost reverent. They were communicating, she realized, not in words, but in images and feelings that bloomed in her mind. They showed her the forest as they saw it, a living network of interconnected consciousness. Every plant, every tree, every creature, part of a vast awareness that humans had forgotten how to perceive. The honey was the key to that perception. It opened doors in the mind, broke down the walls between human consciousness and the greater awareness. The indigenous peoples had used it in ceremonies, maintaining connection to the living world. When that connection broke, humans had become lost, separate. They'd stopped seeing the forest as sacred and started seeing it as resource. That change in perception had led to the broken covenant, the dead loggers, the century of isolation. The bees showed her one more thing, a choice. She could run, fight the binding, try to break free through force. The Guardian would eventually kill her, as it had killed others who'd taken without understanding. Or she could try something no one had attempted in over 100 years. She could try to renew the covenant, try to bridge the gap between human and Guardian, try to become what her people had once been, a keeper, a partner, a voice between worlds. The bees lifted from her skin and flew back toward the cedar. Their humming faded into the night sounds of the forest, sounds she could now hear with extraordinary clarity. Aisling looked at her father's torn journal page, then at the honey vial that still glowed softly in her pack. She thought about spending her life in these mountains, bound to this place, becoming something more and less than fully human. She thought about her cabin, her solitary life, the emptiness that had followed her since Michael died, the isolation she'd chosen, walking mountains alone. Maybe she'd been preparing for this all along. Maybe her whole life had been leading her here, to this choice, this moment. She pulled out her father's compass, holding it up to catch the moonlight. The needle pointed north, steady and true. North toward the cedar, north toward the Guardian, north toward her destiny, whether she accepted it or not. Tomorrow she would try something impossible. Tomorrow she would attempt to speak with something ancient and angry and utterly alone. Tomorrow she would try to make peace with the Guardian of Cedar Basin. If it didn't kill her first, dawn came slowly to Cedar Basin. mist rising from the forest floor like spirits ascending. Aisling had barely slept. She'd spent most of the night preparing, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was preparing for. How did you prepare to negotiate with an ancient entity that existed somewhere between myth and reality? She started by gathering materials. The dried stream bed where she'd found the packed stone seemed significant, so she searched more carefully there. Half buried in silt and moss, she found it, another flat stone, smaller than the first, but clearly worked by human hands. Its symbols were weathered but still visible. This one told a different part of the story. She traced the markings with her fingertips, and understanding came in waves. This was a teaching stone, meant to instruct new guardians, human guardians, in the proper rituals. Offerings to be made, words to be spoken, actions to be taken. The harvest ritual was specific. It could only be done at dawn, during the autumn equinox, when the boundary between worlds was thinnest. The human guardian would approach with empty hands and open heart. They would ask permission, explain the need. The honey would be freely given, never taken. And in return, the human would pledge to protect the sacred grove, to maintain the balance, to serve as bridge between their people and the forest's ancient awareness. She checked her calendar function on her phone. September 22nd, 3 days away. The autumn equinox. The timing couldn't be coincidence. She'd arrived in Cedar Basin just days before the one time of year when the covenant could be renewed. Either that was impossible good luck, or something had been guiding her steps all along. The question was whether the Guardian would accept a new covenant at all. It had been betrayed, had watched humans break every promise. Why would it trust again? Aisling spent the morning in contemplation, sitting at the base of a cedar near her camp. The forest's enhanced awareness that came from the honey allowed her to feel the connections between things, the mycorrhizal networks beneath the soil linking tree roots, the chemical signals plants used to communicate, the intricate web of predator and prey and decomposer that kept the ecosystem balanced. This was what humans had lost, this sense of belonging to something larger, this understanding that you weren't separate from nature, but part of it, embedded in it, dependent on it. Her mother would have loved this, Aisling thought suddenly. Before the cancer, before the treatments, her mother had been an artist who painted forests with an almost mystical reverence. She'd always said that trees had spirits, that the forest spoke to those who knew how to listen. Her father, the pragmatic ranger, had indulged what he thought was artistic fancy, but maybe her mother had been right all along. Maybe she'd been sensitive to what Aisling was now experiencing. Maybe that was why her father had tried to use the honey, not just to heal her body, but to give her back that connection she'd always claimed to feel. And maybe that unauthorized taking, that breaking of covenant in desperation, was what had ultimately killed them both. Her mother from the cancer, her father from the Guardian's slow vengeance. The weight of that realization settled heavy in her chest. Her family's tragedy woven into this place's tragedy. Generations of disconnection and broken trust. Around noon, the Guardian appeared. Not suddenly, not with fanfare. Aisling simply looked up and it was there, standing at the edge of the clearing. In daylight she could see it more clearly. It stood perhaps 8 feet tall, vaguely humanoid but clearly not human. Its body seemed to be made of wood, cedar bark and branch and root, but it moved with fluid grace. Its head was crowned with what looked like honeycomb, golden and dripping. Where its eyes should be, there were hollow spaces filled with swirling darkness and the occasional flicker of golden light. It radiated power and age and deep, abiding loneliness. Aisling stood slowly, keeping her movements non-threatening. She'd approached wounded animals before, creatures in pain who might lash out from fear. This felt similar, though on a scale that made her tiny and fragile by comparison. "I understand now," she said quietly. "I understand what was lost, what was broken." The Guardian didn't speak, but images flooded her mind. She saw the original covenant from its perspective. Generations of humans coming to the sacred grove with respect and gratitude, taking only what was needed, offering prayers and gifts in return, partnership, balance, purpose. Then she saw the betrayal. Loggers with saws and axes and greed, the cedar bleeding, the bees dying in swarms as they tried to protect it, the guardian rising in fury and sorrow, striking down the intruders. The realization that humans couldn't be trusted anymore. Decades of solitude followed. The guardian had stood watch, alone, protecting the chief's resting place from a world that had forgotten why it mattered. It had grown bitter, defensive, trapped in an endless cycle of vigilance without purpose. It showed her what it had done to others who'd found this place over the years. A few hikers, a handful of researchers, one group of treasure hunters. None had been killed, but all had been driven out, confused and terrified, unable to find the grove again even when they tried to return. The Guardian had learned to erase the memory of this place from minds that touched it without permission, but it had let her stay. Why? The answer came not in words, but in feeling, recognition. She carried her father's blood, and her father had been here before. More than that, she carried something else, a capacity for understanding, a willingness to listen, a loneliness that matched its own. "I want to try," Aisling said. "I want to renew the covenant, but I need to know if you can trust humans again. If you can trust me." The Guardian's head tilted, considering. Then it extended one long, bark-covered arm and beckoned her to follow. She did, walking through the forest with this ancient being, feeling privilege and terror in equal measure. They moved deeper into Cedar Basin, to places she hadn't explored. The Guardian showed her the extent of the sacred grove, nearly 5 square miles of old-growth forest, all of it connected to the Great Cedar, all of it part of the network that kept the chief's essence alive. It showed her the damage from the logging attempt a century ago. Trees that bore scars, ground that had never quite healed. Places where the forest's awareness was dimmed, wounded by what humans had done. Then it showed her places of beauty, hidden waterfalls, meadows thick with rare wildflowers, groves where elk came to give birth, protected by the Guardian's presence. The good it had preserved, the life it had protected, the message was clear. It had held the line alone for over 100 years. It was tired, but it had never stopped caring. Never stopped protecting, never stopped hoping that someone might come who understood. As they returned to the Great Cedar, the Guardian placed one heavy hand on Aisling's shoulder. The touch was gentle despite its obvious strength. In that contact, she felt its question, not in words but in pure meaning. Could she be that someone? Could she bridge the gap between human and sacred? Could she dedicate her life to maintaining what her people had once destroyed? Aisling looked up at the massive cedar, at the honey dripping gold in the afternoon light, at the bees that danced in patterns ancient and precise. She thought about her empty cabin, her solitary life, her years of walking mountains alone. She thought about purpose, about belonging, about finding meaning in loss. "Yes," she said, "I can try." The Guardian's hollow eyes flickered with golden light. Then it stepped back and faded into the shadows, leaving her alone with the cedar and the bees and the weight of her promise. 3 days until the equinox. 3 days to prepare herself for a transformation she couldn't fully understand. 3 days until she became something new or died trying. The preparation became ritual. Aisling gathered materials according to the teaching stone's instructions, working with deliberate care. Cedar bark stripped from fallen branches, never from living trees. Stones from the stream bed polished by centuries of water. Plants that grew only in the sacred grove. Ghost pipe, bleeding heart, old man's beard moss. With these, she created a healing salve, the way the teaching stone had shown her. The honey was the catalyst, but it needed to be combined properly, respectfully, with intention and understanding. She worked over her camp stove, measuring by feel rather than measurement, letting instinct guide her hands. The mixture turned golden green, luminescent in the morning light. When it was complete, she tested it on an old scar on her forearm, a burn from a camp stove years ago. She spread a thin layer of the salve over the raised tissue. The effect was immediate. The scar tissue smoothed, color returning to match the surrounding skin. Within minutes, no trace of the old injury remained. The healing went deeper than surface. She felt something inside her settle, some old pain she'd been carrying unknowingly released and resolved. The Guardian had been watching. It emerged from the tree line, and for the first time, Aisling sensed something like approval radiating from it. She'd proven she understood. The honey wasn't meant to be hoarded or exploited. It was meant to heal when used with wisdom and respect. She thought of Roy, his hands twisted with arthritis, of the children with illnesses she'd heard about in town, of the good this could do if used properly. "This is why the covenant matters," she said to the Guardian. "Not for profit, not for power, for healing, for helping." The Guardian's response came as images. It showed her the past, before the covenant was broken. Humans coming to the sacred grove with genuine need. A child dying from infection, saved by the honey. A woman hemorrhaging after childbirth, healed. An elder with a wound that wouldn't close, made whole. The honey had been shared freely, gratefully, reverently, but then it showed her what happened when greed replaced need. A man coming back again and again, taking more and more, trying to sell it. His body warping, his mind fracturing, until the honey's power consumed him. He'd become something neither human nor Guardian, trapped between states, driven mad before the Guardian had mercy killed him. The warning was clear. "Use the honey with wisdom, or it would use you." "I understand," Aisling said. "Balance. Always balance." Over the next 2 days, she and the Guardian developed a strange rapport. It couldn't speak in words, but it communicated through images, feelings, and the movement of the bees. She learned to read its body language, to sense its moods. She learned it had a sense of humor, dry and ancient. When she tripped over a root, it shook in what could only be described as silent laughter. When she successfully identified a rare plant, it sent the bees to encircle her head like a living crown. Approval and gentle teasing combined. She learned it was lonely, desperately, achingly lonely. It had stood watch for over a century, with no companionship, no relief, no one who understood its purpose. The isolation had wounded it as deeply as the betrayal. One evening, as she sat by her campfire, she spoke to it about her own loneliness, about losing Michael, about choosing to walk mountains alone rather than face the pitying looks in town, about feeling disconnected from the world, like she existed half a step out of sync with everyone else. "Maybe that's why I was drawn here," she said quietly. "Maybe I needed this as much as you needed someone to understand." The Guardian settled on the far side of her fire, the first time it had approached so close. In the firelight, its bark-covered form seemed less alien, more like an old friend. It reached out slowly and placed something in her lap. A piece of cedar bark, woven into a rough circle. A crown. Aisling lifted it carefully. The bark was soft, despite its appearance, worked by hands, if the Guardian had hands, that understood the material intimately. Honeycomb was woven into the pattern, creating a lattice of wood and gold. "This is what the human Guardians wore," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. "The bridge between worlds." The Guardian inclined its head. An affirmation. She wasn't just being asked to renew the covenant. She was being asked to become the human Guardian, to stay here, bound to this place, serving as the voice between the forest's awareness and the human world. It was an offer, a gift, and a burden all at once. "If I accept this," she said slowly, working through the implications, "I can't go back to my old life." Not really. The Guardian showed her what it would mean. She could leave the sacred grove, but she'd always be connected to it. She'd age more slowly, her lifespan extended by the honey's preservation. Her senses would remain heightened. She'd be able to hear the forest's needs, feel its pain, understand its rhythms. She could act as intermediary, allowing small amounts of honey to be harvested for genuine healing needs. She could protect the grove from those who would exploit it. She could ensure the covenant was kept, but she'd be set apart from other humans. They'd see her as strange, perhaps dangerous. She'd be bound to Cedar Basin, required to return regularly to maintain the balance. And eventually, centuries from now, she'd become like the Guardian, more forest than human, her consciousness merging with the ancient awareness. It was immortality and imprisonment, freedom and duty, connection and isolation, everything she'd been running from and everything she'd been seeking. Before she could respond, before she could tell the Guardian her decision, a sound shattered the forest's peace. Engines, multiple vehicles, men's voices calling to each other. The crash of equipment being unloaded. The Guardian's head snapped toward the sound, every line of its body going rigid. Threat, intruders, the same tension she'd felt when it first awakened. Aisling stood, her heart sinking. She knew those sounds. She'd heard them hundreds of times during her years with the Forest Service. Someone had found Cedar Basin, and from the amount of equipment, from the organized way they were moving, this wasn't casual hikers who'd gotten lucky. This was a planned expedition, well-funded, determined, and they were heading straight for the sacred grove. The Guardian looked at her, and in its hollow eyes she saw a terrible question. Would she help it defend this place, or would she side with her own kind? Before she could answer, a familiar voice called through the trees. Aisling? Aisling Drake? Are you out here? Roy's voice. Roy had led them here. Her only human friend had betrayed her. The Guardian's hand closed around a tree branch, and the wood screamed as it tore free. Its body shifted, expanding, becoming more solid and more terrible. It was preparing for battle. Preparing to kill. Wait, Aisling said, placing her hand on the Guardian's arm. The bark felt rough against her palm, warm with anger. Let me try to stop this. Please, let me try. The Guardian hesitated, torn between protective fury and reluctant trust. Please, she said again. If we have any hope of humans and the forest coexisting again, it can't start with more killing. Let me try. Slowly, reluctantly, the Guardian lowered its weapon. But it didn't disappear. It stayed visible. A clear warning of what would happen if her attempt at diplomacy failed. Aisling squared her shoulders and walked toward the voices. Toward Roy. Toward whatever force he'd brought to destroy or exploit the sacred grove. She was about to discover just how far human greed would go, and whether her newfound connection to the forest was strong enough to stop it. Aisling emerged from the tree line to find organized chaos. 3 heavy-duty SUVs were parked in a cleared area she hadn't known existed. Someone had scouted this approach before. Equipment was being unloaded, specialized containers with climate control, portable lab gear, sample collection tools that looked expensive and professional, and there, directing the operation, stood a man in his mid-40s wearing expedition clothing that probably cost more than her truck. Perfectly styled dark hair graying at the temples. Expensive watch. The kind of confidence that came from always having money solve his problems. Roy stood off to the side, leaning heavily on a walking stick, his face pale and drawn. When he saw Aisling, relief and guilt warred in his expression. Aisling, thank God, he called out. We were worried. Dr. Vincent Shaw, the well-dressed man interrupted, striding toward her with an extended hand. Biocore Pharmaceuticals. You must be Aisling Drake. Roy's told us a lot about you. Aisling didn't take his hand. She looked at Roy, betrayal sharp in her chest. You told them where I was. My daughter, Roy said quietly, and his voice broke on the words. Emma, she's 26, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 3 months, maybe 4. That was 5 weeks ago. The anger in Aisling's chest fractured. She'd met Emma years ago, a bright young woman studying marine biology. Roy, I'm so sorry. He came to me 6 weeks ago, Roy continued, gesturing toward shore. Said he'd been tracking reports of unusual botanical activity in the Pacific Northwest. Said he had evidence of your father's research from 30 years ago, documentation of a substance with miraculous healing properties. He offered me $2 million for information about where you were going, and full funding for Emma's treatment, experimental protocols that insurance won't cover. Your father was a brilliant man, Shaw said smoothly. Kept meticulous records, though he tried to hide them. Biocore acquired his papers from the Forest Service archives. His notes about the honey were fragmentary but compelling. We've been looking for this location for decades. Aisling's mind raced. Her father's records. Of course he'd documented what he found. He was a scientist at heart. And of course, those records would have eventually fallen into the wrong hands. You don't understand what you're dealing with, she said carefully. This isn't just some rare honey you can harvest and sell. Shaw's smile was patronizing. Ms. Drake, I appreciate your concern for environmental preservation, truly. But Biocore has invested significant resources into developing sustainable extraction methods. We won't harm the ecosystem. We simply want to study the honey's properties, synthesize the active compounds, and make them available to people who need healing. At what price? Aisling asked. How much will you charge for your synthesized compounds? Market rate, Shaw said. Research and development costs are substantial. You'll patent it, Aisling said flatly. You'll create a monopoly on something that should be shared freely. You'll deny access to people who can't afford your prices while you make billions. That's how pharmaceutical development works, Shaw replied, his tone hardening slightly. Without profit incentive, there's no innovation. Surely even you understand that. Behind her, Aisling felt the Guardian's presence growing stronger, anger radiating like heat from a forge. She held up a hand behind her back. Wait, please wait. Roy, she said, focusing on her friend, I understand why you did this. I would have done the same for someone I loved. But you don't know what this place is. What's been protecting it? She's been out here alone too long, Shaw said to Roy, loud enough for Aisling to hear. Classic isolation syndrome. Anthropomorphizing natural phenomena, developing irrational protective feelings. I'm standing right here, Aisling snapped. And I'm not delusional. Then you'll have no objection to showing us where the hive is located, Shaw said. We're prepared to compensate you generously for your cooperation. Roy mentioned you operate on grants and small research stipends. How does $200,000 sound? It sounds like you think everything has a price. In my experience, everything does. The team Shaw had brought was efficient. While they'd been talking, they'd set up a base camp, complete with portable lab equipment and communication gear. 8 people total, all professional, all focused on their tasks. This wasn't a speculative expedition. This was a military-style extraction operation. Aisling's satellite phone suddenly crackled to life. She pulled it from her belt, startled. It had been dead for days. Now it showed full signal, multiple missed calls, and a text message from Roy's number sent 3 days ago. I'm so sorry. They have Emma. They promised they could save her. I had to tell them. Please forgive me. She looked at Roy, who was staring at his feet. You've been trying to warn me. Signal's been blocked until now, one of Shaw's technicians called out. Unusual electromagnetic interference in this valley. Just got the booster working. You brought signal jamming equipment, Aisling realized. You were blocking my communications, Shaw shrugged. We needed to ensure the site remained secure until we could establish proper protocols. Your friend was concerned you'd warn off visitors. We simply ensured you couldn't. The casual admission of manipulation, the complete lack of shame, the entitled certainty that his goals justified his methods. It all crystallized Aisling's understanding of what she was dealing with. Shaw didn't see the sacred grove as something to respect. He saw it as a resource to exploit, and anyone who got in his way was simply an obstacle to be removed or bought off. You need to leave, she said quietly. Right now. Pack up and leave, Shaw laughed. I don't think so. We have every legal right to be here. This is national forest land, open to permitted research. We have permits. He pulled papers from his jacket. Signed by the regional director himself. We can stay for up to 6 months conducting our studies. Aisling barely glanced at the papers. She knew they'd be legitimate. Money could buy anything, including official permissions from underfunded government agencies. Those permits mean nothing here. They mean everything here, Shaw corrected. We're operating entirely within the law. If you interfere with legitimate research, you'll be the one in legal trouble. I'm trying to save your lives, Aisling said, and something in her voice must have conveyed her absolute seriousness, because Shaw's smile faltered slightly. What are you talking about? Before she could answer, one of Shaw's team members called out from near the tree line. Dr. Shaw, you need to see this. We found the primary tree. And the hive structure is extraordinary. It's exactly as the historical records described, but larger. Much larger. Shaw's attention snapped toward the voice. Show me. Don't, Aisling said. Please, just take Roy and leave. I'll get you a sample of the honey. I'll share the research, but you can't go to the tree. You can't disturb the hive. Your concern is noted and dismissed, Shaw said coldly. To his team, begin collection operations. Full protocols. I want comprehensive samples. The team moved with practiced efficiency toward the great cedar. Aisling tried to follow, but one of Shaw's people, a large man who looked more security than scientist, stepped into her path. Dr. Shaw said, "You should stay here, ma'am." Roy limped to her side. Aisling, I didn't know it would be like this. I thought they'd just take some samples, study it, maybe make medicine for Emma. I didn't know they'd... It's okay, Aisling said, though it wasn't. Nothing about this was okay. Your daughter needs you. I understand. What did you mean about saving their lives? Aisling looked toward where Shaw's team was approaching the sacred grove, loaded with equipment designed to take everything they could carry. She felt the Guardian's presence growing stronger, felt its barely contained fury, felt the forest itself responding to the threat. This place is protected, she said quietly. Not by laws or permits, by something much older, much more powerful. And it's been waiting a very long time for someone to give it a reason to act. Roy's face paled. The old stories. The loggers who disappeared. You're saying they're true. I'm saying your friend Shaw is about to learn that some boundaries aren't suggestions. They're warnings. From the direction of the great cedar came a shout of triumph, then excited chatter as Shaw's team saw the glowing honey for the first time. Aisling heard Shaw's voice, commanding and certain. Get the collection equipment ready. We're going to take everything we can carry. The forest grew silent. Even the wind died. Aisling felt the Guardian rise fully into awareness, felt its decision crystallize. It had given her a chance to resolve this peacefully. That chance had failed. Now it would do what it had always done, protect the sacred grove by any means necessary. Get down, she said to Roy, pulling him toward cover. Get down now and don't move. What? The Guardian emerged from the forest like wrath made solid, 8 feet of ancient fury and protective rage. The bees rose in a swarm that blotted out the sun, their humming a war cry that made the air vibrate, and somewhere in the distance, Shaw screamed. The chaos unfolded in terrible slow motion. Shaw's team scattered like leaves in a hurricane, dropping equipment as they ran. But they'd made it all the way to the great cedar before the Guardian manifested. And now they were trapped between the ancient being and the dense forest that had suddenly become hostile. Aisling ran toward the grove, Roy limping behind her despite her telling him to stay put. She had to stop this before people died. The Guardian was fully present now, larger than she'd ever seen it. Its form solid and substantial, and radiating power that made the air shimmer. Shaw stood frozen at the base of the cedar, staring up at the Guardian with an expression that cycled between terror and disbelief. His hands were still on a collection device he'd been attempting to attach to the hive. Honey dripped onto his expensive jacket, staining it gold. What is that thing? He breathed. The reason you should have listened, Aisling said, reaching his side. She looked up at the Guardian. Please don't do this. Let me handle it. The Guardian's hollow eyes fixed on Shaw, and Aisling felt its judgment like a physical force. This man had come with greed and arrogance and intent to violate the sacred. He deserved what the loggers had received. But then, the Guardian's gaze shifted to Roy, struggling to reach them despite his bad leg, his face desperate. And Aisling felt something in the ancient being hesitate. Roy's presence complicated things. Roy was in pain, his motivations rooted in love rather than greed. The Guardian understood love. It had been born from love, a chief's love for his people and his land. Listen to me, Aisling said urgently, speaking to both the Guardian and Shaw. There's a way to resolve this without violence. But everyone has to choose it, Shaw found his voice. It can't be. His scientific worldview was shattering around him, unable to contain what his eyes were seeing. It is, Aisling said firmly. It's real, it's ancient, and it's been protecting this grove for over a century. You can't fight it. You can't contain it. Your only choice is to leave peacefully or... One of Shaw's team members, the large security man who'd blocked Aisling earlier, pulled a weapon from his jacket. A tranquilizer rifle, the kind used for dangerous wildlife. No! Aisling and Roy shouted simultaneously. The man fired. The dart flew true, hitting the Guardian's center mass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Guardian reached up, pulled the dart from its bark-covered chest, and crushed it between finger-like appendages. The chemicals inside hissed and steamed, eating through the wood of its hand, but causing no apparent pain. The Guardian's head turned toward the shooter with terrible deliberation. Aisling threw herself in front of the man. He didn't understand. He was trying to protect his employer. It's not his fault. The Guardian's hand shot out, impossibly fast, and closed around Shaw, not the security guard, not anyone else. Shaw. It lifted him off his feet, holding him suspended in the air. Honey began flowing from the Guardian's hand, coating Shaw's body like amber, hardening into a shell that trapped him in place. Shaw screamed, struggled, but the honey held him fast. His team members rushed forward, then fell back as the bees swarmed closer, a living wall of warning. "Let him go," Aisling pleaded. "Please, this doesn't solve anything. It just perpetuates the cycle of violence and mistrust." The Guardian showed her images. Shaw's future if released. He'd come back with more people, more equipment, more weapons. He'd lobby to have the protected forest status removed. He'd use his wealth and connections to destroy what couldn't be defended through legal means. He was a threat that would never stop threatening. And maybe the Guardian was right. Maybe Shaw would do exactly that. But killing him meant giving up on any hope of coexistence. It meant accepting that humans and the forest were enemies, forever and always. "There's another way," Aisling said desperately. She turned to Shaw, still trapped in his amber prison. "Dr. Shaw, listen to me. If it releases you, if I convince it to let you go, will you leave and never come back? Will you destroy your research, abandon the project, walk away completely?" Shaw's eyes, the only part of him that could move, darted between her and the Guardian. She could see him calculating, trying to figure out what answer would save him. "The truth," she said sharply. "It can sense lies. Don't try to manipulate your way out of this." "I can't," Shaw said, his voice muffled by the honey coating. "I've invested too much. Biocore has invested too much. If I walk away with nothing, I'll be finished. My career, my reputation, everything. Better than being dead," Roy said, finally reaching them. He looked at Shaw with something like pity. "Let it go, Vincent. Some things aren't worth dying for." "Easy for you to say," Shaw replied bitterly. "Your daughter doesn't need funding. I promised Emma's treatment in exchange for information. If I fail to deliver the honey, Biocore cuts the funding. She dies, so I can't walk away, don't you understand? I have to succeed." The revelation hit like cold water. Roy's face went white. "You tied Emma's treatment to your success. You made her survival conditional on you getting what you want?" "It's standard business practice," Shaw said. "Incentive structures drive results." "She's a person," Roy said, his voice shaking. "A dying girl, not a business incentive." Aisling felt something break inside the Guardian. Not anger, worse than anger. Disappointment. It had hoped maybe that humans had evolved beyond this kind of cruelty. That compassion might have grown in the century it had stood watch. But Shaw's casual admission of using a dying girl as a leverage confirmed what the Guardian had feared. Humans were still selfish, still destructive, still dangerous. It began to squeeze. Shaw screamed. The honey coating cracked, tightened. In moments he would be crushed like an insect in tree sap. "Stop!" Aisling grabbed the cedar bark crown from where she'd tucked it into her belt. She placed it on her head, feeling its weight settle into place. "I accept. I accept the covenant. I become the human guardian. But the first act of the new covenant is mercy. Please, show mercy." The Guardian paused. The honey stopped tightening. Aisling felt power flow through the crown, connecting her to the forest's awareness in ways the honey alone hadn't. She could feel every tree, every root, every life in Cedar Basin. She could feel the Guardian's consciousness, ancient and complex and tired. so very tired, and she understood. The Guardian didn't want to kill Shaw. It didn't want to kill anyone. It was simply the only solution it knew. Violence had been its answer for so long that it had forgotten there could be other answers. "Let me try something," Aisling said. "Trust me, please. If it doesn't work, you can still do what you think is necessary. But give me a chance." Slowly, reluctantly, the Guardian lowered Shaw back to the ground. The honey coating remained, trapping him, but the threat of crushing receded. Aisling turned to Roy. "Your daughter, where is she being treated?" "Seattle, Pacific Northwest Medical Center, and the experimental treatment BioCore promised." "What is it?" "Immunotherapy. Targeted T-cell therapy. It's expensive, not covered by insurance. The trial slots are limited." Aisling knelt and pulled out her small jar of the healing salve she'd created. She'd used most of it on her own scar, but enough remained. She held it up to the Guardian. "One dose. For Emma. Not because Shaw demands it, but because an innocent girl shouldn't die for her father's mistakes. Can we agree to that?" The Guardian considered. Then slowly it nodded. Aisling handed the jar to Roy. "Take this to her. Put it on her skin anywhere the cancer is present. It should help. I can't promise it will cure her completely, but it should give her a chance." Roy took the jar with shaking hands. "Aisling, I don't know what to say. Say you'll take her somewhere far from here when she recovers. Somewhere Shaw can't use her again. And say you'll never tell anyone where this came from. I promise. Both. I swear." "Good." Aisling turned back to Shaw. "Here's what's going to happen. The Guardian will release you. You and your team will pack up and leave immediately. You'll destroy all your research on the honey. You'll tell BioCore the lead was false, the location a dead end. You'll cancel Emma's treatment funding. She doesn't need it anymore." "And if I refuse?" Shaw asked, some of his arrogance returning now that immediate death seemed less certain. Aisling smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Then I'll let the Guardian do what it wants. And I'll use my new position as human guardian to ensure that every time you try to come back in any way, the forest itself will stop you. You'll get lost every time you approach. Your equipment will fail. Your funding will mysteriously dry up. I'm part of the forest now, Dr. Shaw. I can feel your presence like a splinter in living wood. And I'll be watching for you for the rest of your very long life." The threat hung in the air. Shaw looked into her eyes and saw she meant every word. "Fine," he said finally. "Release me and we'll leave." The Guardian looked at Aisling. One final confirmation. Was she sure about this? About showing mercy to someone who'd shown none? Aisling nodded. "The new covenant starts with forgiveness. That's how we break the cycle." The honey coating dissolved, flowing back into the Guardian's hand. Shaw stumbled, fell to his knees, gasping. His team rushed to help him up. "Go," Aisling said. Now, before it changes its mind, they went, scrambling to gather equipment, packing with frantic speed. Roy paused long enough to embrace Aisling tightly. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for my daughter's life." "Thank the forest," Aisling replied. "I'm just the voice between worlds now." Roy pulled back, studying her face. "You're really going to stay, aren't you? Stay here forever?" "Not forever," Aisling said. "Just until someone else is ready to take the crown. Could be decades. Could be centuries. Time moves differently when you're part of something this old." Roy's eyes filled with tears. "I'll miss you, friend. I'll miss you too. But I'll be here. If you ever need to talk to the mountains, come to the edge of Cedar Basin and call my name. I'll hear you." Within an hour, Shaw's expedition had packed and departed. The sound of engines faded into the distance. The forest grew quiet again, peaceful, as if the invasion had never happened. Aisling stood before the great cedar, the crown on her head feeling more natural with each passing moment. The Guardian stood beside her, no longer threatening, no longer alone. "Tomorrow is the equinox," she said. "We'll perform the ritual properly. Renew the covenant the right way. But tonight, tell me about the chief who started all this. Tell me about the person whose love created you." The Guardian settled against the cedar, and through images and feelings, it told her the story of a chief who loved his people so deeply that his dying wish was to protect their land forever. Of how his spirit had merged with the cedar, his life essence becoming the honey, his love becoming the Guardian. of centuries of watching, protecting, hoping that someday humans would remember how to live in balance with the sacred. As night fell over Cedar Basin, Aisling realized she'd finally found what she'd been seeking in all her years of walking mountains alone. Not isolation, but integration. Not separation from the world, but connection to something older and deeper and more meaningful than she'd ever imagined possible. She'd come to the mountains to document rare plants. Instead, she'd become something rare herself. A bridge between worlds, a keeper of ancient covenants, a guardian of the sacred, and she'd never been less alone. The autumn equinox dawned clear and cold, frost sparkling on the forest floor like scattered diamonds. Aisling had barely slept, spending most of the night preparing herself mentally for what was to come. The crown rested on a flat stone beside her tent, waiting. The teaching stone's instructions were clear in her mind, integrated into her consciousness through days of study and the honey's enhancement. She bathed in the cold stream as the sun rose, washing away the remnants of her old life. The ritual required purity of intention, cleanliness of body and spirit. The water was painfully cold, but she welcomed the sensation. It made her feel present, alive, aware. After drying off and dressing in clean clothes, simple, practical, nothing that would come between her and the earth, she gathered the materials for the offering. The carved wooden bowl she'd spent 2 days creating sat ready, its interior smooth and perfect. She'd made it from a fallen cedar branch, asking permission from the tree before taking it, thanking it for its sacrifice. Into the bowl she placed items of significance. A lock of her hair representing her physical self. A piece of her father's compass, the glass face she'd carefully removed, representing her heritage and family connection. A photograph of Michael, her late husband, representing her capacity for love, despite loss. And finally, a handful of soil from her mother's garden, preserved in a small pouch she'd carried for years, representing the unbroken connection between generations. These offerings weren't required by the teaching stone, but they felt necessary. She was giving herself to this covenant completely, and that meant bringing all of herself, past, present, and future, into the sacred space. The guardian appeared as she carried the bowl toward the great cedar. It looked different in the dawn light, less threatening, more like what it truly was, a protector, a keeper, a being of profound dedication. It had adorned itself with early autumn leaves woven into the bark of its body, and fresh honeycomb glowed in its crown. "I'm ready," Aisling said simply. The guardian led her to the base of the cedar, where the symbols spiraled into the earth. Together they began to dig, carefully, respectfully, clearing away moss and soil and centuries of accumulated forest floor. Within an hour, they'd exposed what lay beneath. The chief's remains were remarkably preserved, wrapped in cedar bark that had been treated with honey, creating a preservation beyond mummification. Even after centuries, his face was visible, peaceful, his hands folded across his chest. He'd been a large man, strong, and someone had placed great care in his burial. Love evident in every detail. Aisling felt tears on her cheeks. This was someone's grandfather, someone's leader, someone's friend. He'd been real, fully human, with hopes and fears and the capacity to love so deeply that it transcended death itself. She placed the offering bowl beside his folded hands. "I come with respect," she said, speaking the words the teaching stone had taught her. "I come with understanding. I come to renew what was broken, to restore what was lost, to serve as bridge between worlds. I offer myself as guardian, as keeper, as voice for the sacred. I pledge my life to maintaining balance, to protecting this grove, to honoring your sacrifice and your love." The guardian placed one heavy hand on her shoulder. Its touch was gentle now, trusting. It spoke without words, its communication pure intention. The pact requires completion. The honey must be accepted, not taken. Will you accept what is freely given? "I will," Aisling said. The guardian reached up to the massive hive. Honey flowed down into its palm, more than gravity should allow, as if the honey itself was eager to be part of this renewal. The golden substance glowed brilliantly in the morning light. pulsing with life and power and ancient consciousness. The guardian held its palm over the offering bowl, and the honey dripped down, mixing with the items Aisling had placed there. Her hair dissolved into golden strands. The compass glass became luminescent. Michael's photograph seemed to come alive, his smile radiating warmth. Her mother's soil turned to rich, dark loam that smelled of growing things and hope. When the bowl was full, the guardian lifted it and held it out to Aisling. The final test. The ultimate acceptance. To drink the honey mixed with her offerings, to literally consume the pact, to make it part of her cellular structure. Aisling took the bowl in both hands. It was warm, almost hot, vibrating with energy. She looked down at the golden mixture, seeing her entire life reflected in its surface. Past, present and future swirling together in liquid light. She thought of Michael, who would have supported this choice. Of her father, who had stood in this same place and made a different choice. Of her mother, who had always known there was more to the forest than science could measure. She thought of Roy and Emma, of Shaw and his team, of all the ways humans had broken connection with the sacred and all the ways that connection might be restored. She thought of the Guardian, standing watch alone for over a century, and how it would finally have a companion again. How they'd stand watch together, protecting what needed protection, sharing what could be shared, maintaining the balance that made life possible. She lifted the bowl to her lips and drank. The transformation began immediately. The honey flowed through her like liquid consciousness, reshaping her from the inside out. Aisling fell to her knees, the bowl clattering away, but she didn't feel pain. She felt expansion. Her awareness spread outward in concentric circles, touching every living thing in Cedar Basin. She felt the trees' slow thoughts, their patient communication through root and fungus. She felt the deer bedded down in the thickets, their dreams of safety and grass. She felt the salmon fighting upstream to spawn, their determination encoded in every cell. She felt the microscopic life in the soil, the vast universe of bacteria and arthropods that made the forest floor function. And she felt the chief. His consciousness diffused through the honey, woven into the fabric of the forest itself. He welcomed her, a presence both fatherly and ancient, approving of her choice, grateful for her sacrifice. The physical changes came next. Her senses, already enhanced, deepened further. She could see colors beyond human spectrum, ultraviolet patterns on flowers, infrared heat signatures of animals. She could hear the ultrasonic calls of bats, the subsonic rumbles of the earth settling. She could taste the air, reading its chemical composition, knowing what had passed through recently and what was approaching. Her body grew stronger, more resilient. She felt her cells restructuring, the honey working at a molecular level, rewriting parts of her genetic code. She would age far more slowly now, possibly not at all in any meaningful human time frame. Injuries would heal rapidly. Diseases would find no purchase in her transformed biology. But the deepest change was in her consciousness itself. Where she'd once been a single voice, a solitary self, she was now connected to something vast and ancient. The forest's awareness, the guardian's purpose, the chief's love, they all flowed through her, expanding her sense of self until it encompassed far more than just Aisling Drake. 52-year-old botanist, she was the forest keeper, the bridge between worlds. The voice of the sacred made flesh. The guardian helped her to her feet as the transformation completed. She swayed, adjusting to her new state of being, learning to filter the overwhelming input of sensory data that now flooded her consciousness constantly. "I understand now," she whispered, "why you've been alone so long. How hard it is to exist between states. You're not fully physical anymore, but not fully spirit either. You're the boundary itself." The guardian inclined its head. "An affirmation. And now you are too. We are both guardians now, both bridges. The weight can be shared." Aisling felt its relief like sunshine after rain. For the first time in over a century, it wasn't alone. For the first time since the covenant broke, there was hope that it might actually work. This partnership between human and ancient, between flesh and forest. She reached out and took the guardian's hand. Where once the bark had felt rough and alien, now it felt familiar, like her own skin. Because in a sense it was. They were both part of the same whole now, two expressions of the same protective force. Together they returned to the chief's resting place. The morning sun had climbed higher, illuminating the sacred grove with golden light. The bees circled them in complex patterns, singing their approval in harmonics that made the air shimmer. The guardian knelt beside the chief's preserved body and began the closing ritual. Gently, reverently, they replaced the soil, covering the remains once more. As they worked, Aisling felt the chief's presence growing fainter, more diffuse, satisfied that his legacy would continue. His spirit could rest more deeply now, knowing the covenant was restored. When the burial was complete, the guardian did something Aisling hadn't expected. It reached up and removed a small piece of honeycomb from its crown, then held it out to her. "This is my gift. For your friend's daughter, pure, untransformed. It will heal her completely, with no binding, no transformation. She deserves life, free from burden." Aisling took the honeycomb carefully. It was warm in her hands, glowing softly. "Thank you." "This is mercy." The guardian's hollow eyes flickered with golden light. "The new covenant begins with mercy. That is what you taught me. That is why the pact can hold this time." They stood together as the sun continued its climb, two guardians of the sacred grove, bound by purpose and transformed by honey and united in protection. Around them, the forest hummed with renewed vitality, as if the very trees were celebrating the restoration of balance. Aisling felt the weight of centuries settle onto her shoulders, not crushing, but grounding. This was her purpose now. This was why she'd walked mountains alone for so long, seeking something she couldn't name. She'd been preparing, training, learning to be what the forest needed. The guardian began to fade, becoming translucent. Its work was complete. The pact was renewed. It could finally rest, knowing the cedar was protected, the chief honored, the balance maintained. "Wait," Aisling thought at it urgently. "You're leaving?" "Not leaving, sleeping. You know how to call me if danger comes. But for now, you are guardian enough. The forest trusts you. I trust you. Rest well, Bridgekeeper. You have earned what I could not give myself, peace." The guardian dissolved into morning mist, leaving Aisling alone in the sacred grove, alone, but not lonely, connected to everything, finally home. 3 months had passed since the equinox, though time felt different now to Aisling. She measured it in seasons and cycles, rather than days and hours. The forest had its own rhythm, and she'd learned to move with it, rather than against it. Her cabin at the edge of civilization had become a boundary marker, a threshold between worlds. She spent most of her time in Cedar Basin now, but she returned to the cabin weekly, maintaining the appearance of normalcy for any who might check on her. Roy knew the truth. Everyone else simply thought she'd become more reclusive than before. She'd adapted to her new existence with surprising ease. The enhanced senses that had initially overwhelmed her were now second nature. She could feel the forest's health in her bones, knew when a tree was sick or when deer populations needed culling. She'd become what the teaching stone had described, a keeper, a tender, a voice translating between human need and forest wisdom. The first visitors came in late October. Hikers who'd somehow found their way through the maze of trails that usually turned people around. Aisling had felt them approaching hours before they arrived, had prepared herself to be welcoming rather than threatening. They were young, a couple in their 30s with a sick child. They'd heard rumors, they said, of a woman in the mountains who knew old healing ways. Desperate parents following whispers and hope, Aisling had examined their daughter, 7 years old, with an autoimmune condition causing her joints to swell painfully. She'd prepared a careful salve using the honey, measured precisely, nothing that would transform or bind. Just healing, just mercy. The girl improved within days. The family left grateful, promising to tell no one, though Aisling knew that was impossible. Word would spread. Others would come. That was acceptable, even necessary. The covenant required sharing carefully and wisely. She could handle a few visitors seeking healing, especially if they came with respect. Roy visited monthly, bringing supplies and news from the outside world. Emma had recovered completely, the honeycomb's gift more effective than any human medicine could have been. She was returning to graduate school, planning to study environmental conservation. Roy had taken early retirement, moved to a small house near the coast where Emma could visit easily. "She wants to meet you someday," Roy told Aisling during his November visit. "To thank you properly." "Maybe," Aisling said, "when she's older. When she can understand what this place is and why it matters." Roy studied her in the afternoon light. "You look younger." "It's subtle, but I can see it. The grey in your hair is less. The lines on your face are softer. The honey preserves," Aisling said simply. "I'll age, but slowly. Very slowly. How long?" "I don't know. The chief lived 70 years before dying and becoming the honey. I might live centuries if I choose to, or I can pass the crown to someone else when I'm ready." Roy was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it?" Aisling looked out at the mountains, feeling the forest's consciousness humming beneath her awareness like a vast, complex song. "No, I found something I didn't know I was missing. Purpose, connection, home. I'm part of something that matters on a timescale beyond human lifespans. How could I regret that?" She started teaching a young woman named Fiona McKay, a naturalist in her late 20s who'd stumbled into Cedar Basin in early December. Unlike most visitors, Fiona hadn't been turned around by the forest. She'd been drawn in, welcomed, marked as someone with potential. Aisling recognized the signs. The forest was already preparing for succession, for the time when she'd need an apprentice. Fiona had the right temperament, patient, observant, respectful. She listened to the forest rather than imposing herself upon it. "The trees talk, don't they?" Fiona had said during her third visit. "Not in words, but in something older." "Yes," Aisling had replied, pleased. "And if you're patient, you'll learn their language." Shaw, true to his word, hadn't returned. Aisling felt him sometimes, his consciousness like a discordant note at the edge of her awareness whenever he thought about Cedar Basin. But he'd destroyed his research, convinced Biocor the lead was worthless, moved on to other projects. Veer was an excellent teacher even for men like him. As winter settled over the mountains, Aisling stood before the great cedar and reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd come seeking rare plants to document. She'd found something far rarer, a sacred trust that had waited centuries for someone worthy to accept it. Her father's compass hung from a branch of the cedar now, an offering to his memory. She visited it often, told him about her days, thanked him for preparing her even if he'd never intended to. He'd tried to protect her from this destiny, but perhaps he'd actually been preparing her for it all along. Every evening at sunset, she performed a small ritual. She'd take a moment to touch the cedar's bark, feeling the chief's presence, feeling the guardian resting in its well-earned sleep. She'd thank them for their trust, promise once again to maintain the balance, to serve as bridge between worlds. And every evening, the forest answered. Not in words, but in the feeling of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. She'd spent most of her life walking mountains alone, seeking solitude in wild places. She'd thought she was running from connection, from the pain of loss, from the difficulty of human relationships, but she'd actually been searching for the one place where her particular strengths, her knowledge, her patience, her capacity for solitude, her respect for the natural world, would matter most. She'd found it. In a grove of ancient cedars, with glowing honey and protective bees, with a covenant renewed and a purpose restored. She was Aisling Drake, keeper of Cedar Basin, voice between worlds, guardian of the sacred. She was exactly who she was meant to be, and in the quiet moments between sunset and night, when the forest held its breath and the boundary between worlds grew thin, she could feel the chief's approval, the guardian's gratitude, and the deep, abiding peace of being fully, completely, irrevocably home. Some treasures, she'd learned, aren't meant to be shared widely. They're meant to be protected fiercely, honored deeply, and served with everything you have. The rare honey in the mountains had transformed her life. But more than that, it had given her life meaning beyond anything she'd known before, and that she knew was the real treasure. Not the honey itself, but what it represented: connection, purpose, belonging, and the profound satisfaction of becoming what the world needed you to be. She stood watch over the sacred grove as snow began to fall, the first of winter, and smiled. This was her life now. This was her calling. This was her joy. And she wouldn't have changed a single moment of the journey that had brought her here.